Access to Democracy is made possible by donations from the following organizations. Thomson Reuters, a global company with expertise and insight to unravel complex situations in the areas of law, tax, compliance, government, and media. Their worldwide network of journalists and editors keep customers up to speed on relevant global events. Thomson Reuters, The Answer Company. Crutchfield Dermatology, a full-service treatment center and Medi-Spa in Eagan. Their goal is to help you look good and feel great with beautiful skin. The Minnesota Twins are looking forward to another great season in 2023, led by the return of All-Stars Carlos Correa and Brian Buxton. With the return of numerous players who were injured in 2022 and some new acquisitions, another division crown and a return to the World Series are in their sights. Established in 2007, 45th Parallel Spirits was among the first 50 micro-distilleries in the United States. Based in New Richmond, Wisconsin, all aspects of production occur at our facility. If you're interested in visiting and learning more about the 45th Parallel Distillery, please check our website and plan a visit to tour our facility and taste our spirits. Truestone Financial, with locations in Minnesota and Wisconsin, has proudly served its members since 1939. Truestone engages, educates, and supports its members to ensure they have the tools to empower their financial well-being. Truestone Financial, your neighborhood credit union. Learn more at truestone.org.
Hello and welcome to another edition of Access to Democracy. I'm your host, Steve Francisco. It's my pleasure today to invite back to our studio a returning guest, Ethan Roberts, the Deputy Executive Director of the Jewish Community Relations Council of Minnesota and the Dakotas. Wow, that's a mouthful.
It is a mouthful, and you got it perfect.
Welcome back to Access to Democracy.
Thank you.
So, we understand you're a native of Boston, but you've been in Minnesota actually since about 1992 when you attended Macalester College. Fair to say you're a Red Sox fan and a Patriots fan?
Yes.
Yeah. So you still have loyalty to your local teams from where you grew up. We'll let you get by with that.
Yeah, I sometimes, because we know each other from government affairs work, from right. advocacy work, and sometimes I like to think that my kind of East Coast sensibilities is sort of, it's not exactly like Superman type power abilities, but like, yes, I think I still have that East Coast mentality and kind of approach to the world, which includes my passion for the Patriots and the Red Sox. Yes.
So tell us just briefly, what is the mission of JCRC?
Sure. The Jewish Community Relations Council of Minnesota and Dakotas, JCRC, we are the consensus public affairs voice for the Jewish community here in Minnesota and the Dakotas. We are the bridge between our Jewish community and other communities, be it other racial communities, other religious communities, other ethnic communities. We're the voice that is at the Capitol, speaking from the kind of Jewish perspective, or consensus Jewish perspective. We're the liaison of law enforcement. We commemorate and honor the victims of the Holocaust. We do social justice work. So we do a lot of different things, but mainly I think of us as the public affairs voice.
Mm-hmm. And advocacy, as you mentioned, is a very important part of your work, which
Absolutely.
in fact is how you and I met about 14 years ago, I believe, something like that.
Yeah.
So I had a conversation with a good friend of mine who I used to work with in Washington, D.C., and we were having, he happens to be Jewish American, and we had a conversation, what does it mean to be Jewish?
Sure.
What does it mean to be Jewish?
For me, and I think for many other Jews, to be Jewish is to be part of a people. We are a multi-ethnic people, a multiracial people, people who are bound together with a religion, Judaism. Judaism is the religion of the Jewish people. But first and foremost, it's a sense of peoplehood, which means that, for example, this past spring, I was together with a group of Israelis who were coming over, and some of them have a very similar ethnic background that I have. Maybe their families came from Eastern Europe, survived the Holocaust. Others was a woman who literally walked out of Ethiopia with her family. And she's as Jewish and as much as part of the Jewish people as I am. And so while Judaism is obviously a religion, and I am Jewish, I practice that religion, it's more than a religion to be Jewish. It's to be part of
But there are non-practicing Jews who don't attend synagogue.
Absolutely, right. And I think that sometimes that can be confusing for people. That I mean, somebody can be Jewish and an atheist. Someone can be Jewish and agnostic.
And be Jewish and be Orthodox or Reform or
many
conservative.
variances, many different types of practice, many different beliefs within kind of the spectrum of Judaism, but we're all connected to each other as being part of a people with a shared history and a shared destiny.
Very good. Very diverse community, more diverse than people may realize.
Far more diverse than people may realize, especially if most of the Jews you know happen to be people who look like me or come from kind of my background. You know, for example, in Israel, over half the population, the Jewish population, are Jews who come from the Middle East. So very different background.
So let's talk, we talked a moment ago about advocacy being a key part of what JCRC does, although you do many things.
Sure.
This was an historic session of the Minnesota legislature.
Yes, it was.
So if we were to look back at the session that just concluded in May, what would you look back and say were a couple of the biggest victories that you and JCRC were able to celebrate with this session of the Minnesota legislature?
So in the JCRC's approach to advocacy work, and really I think to many aspects of what we do, we're trying to balance the universal and the particular. So one of the greatest Jewish rabbis, sages, Rav Hillel, who's a contemporary of Jesus, there's a kind of famous quote that's attributed to him, which is, "If I'm not for myself, then who will be? If I'm only for myself, then what am I? And if not now, when?" Well, that last part, if not now, when, was certainly true for lots of folks at the Capitol with the flurry of activity. When we look at our advocacy, we look at our work, we try to consider what are the issues that we need to do to care for our own community, and what are the issues and where are the areas that we can improve this state that we love for everyone who lives here. And sometimes it's the same bill. So I'll give you an example. We were the lead in passing legislation to require the teaching of the Holocaust, but also
in public schools,
in middle and high school, but also the genocide of indigenous people, especially here in Minnesota, and other genocides. So it's both a particular Jewish priority, but also of real importance to other Minnesotans, particularly from an indigenous background, and other communities who've resettled here who were victims of genocide. And so in one bill, you could bring together all of these different communities which had this shared tragic history. It's a club no one wants to be part of, being the victims of genocide, and advancing something that, at least according to the research, indicates that when students study about the Holocaust or other genocides, it tends to make them the better citizens, better adults, better human beings that we would want. More empathetic.
Teaching people empathy for other people
teaching more
and
empathy.
Other cultures.
That's what some of the research at the ADL has found. Other priorities. Been working for years on this bill, on this funding stream for a program that prepares low-income, largely immigrant families, their children for lifelong school success. It's a program of our partner agency, Jewish Family and Children's Service in Minneapolis. They have partners of other nonprofits. This kind of goes back to what our shared history of the Minnesota Council nonprofits throughout Minnesota, and we needed to increase funding so that those partner sites can keep going. And we were successful at that. And then something that, again, back to kind of the particular, but also the universal, there's a funding stream to supplement federal dollars that enable largely houses of worship to be more secure. So increasingly, community security is a huge core, I guess that's redundant. It's a very significant part of the JCRC's work, and through this funding stream, it's not just synagogues, or Jewish community centers that can get funding, but also mosques, churches, Hindu temples.
Sadly, because of the headlines we read about violent criminal attacks against houses of worship.
Yes, especially in Minnesota, we've had many arson attacks against mosques in particular. Synagogues have not, unfortunately, been victims of that level of, but they are definitely they're at higher risk.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting when you talk about your legislative work that you do. It seems as if coalitions are almost always a key part of that work. While there may be some issues that you folks are working on by yourselves, it seems like many of your issues are in coalition with other groups. Fair to say?
Absolutely. I mean, the Jewish community in Minnesota is only about 1% of the state's population. Nationally, we're about 2%. Really not much gets done, I think, at the Capitol without allies, without coalitions. And we're part of a lot of informal coalitions, and we're also part of formal coalitions. So, for example, we're a founding member of the Joint Religious Legislative Coalition, JRLC. I just had a meeting this morning with their executive director and faith leaders from the Catholic, Protestant, and Muslim communities, and talking about what priorities are they going to work on, are we going to work on this session. JRLC for several years now has had a real focus on anti-poverty, legislation, and so they've had some great successes last session and looking to do more good work, and we help fund it, we help support it, and with our time and expertise, and it's great to sit together with people from other faith communities for the common good.
I recall some years back you and I working with Reverend Mark Peters, I believe, from the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, and they were doing work on the social justice issues back then. Yeah. Very good. Let's shift our focus, if we could, for a moment to foreign policy.
Sure.
We continue to watch events playing out in Israel and the Middle East, the difficult situation between Israelis and Palestinians with regard to settlements, sadly terrorist attacks against people in the streets of Israel and other places. The U.S. policy for years has supported a so-called two-state solution.
Right.
The idea that Israel should be able to exist secure and free, and that the Palestinians should be able to determine their own future too. This conflict has been long-running. Does JCRC support a policy, the two-state solution? And is the two-state solution even viable when you have a government in Israel, the Netanyahu government, that is continuing to push expanding settlements into occupied territories?
So JCRC has had a position in support of a two-state solution for I think as long as I've been there, probably longer, right? So that goes back to 2007. So definitely we are a supporter of a two-state solution. Two-state solution is often, I think, viewed as like kind of the least bad option, right? So it's very easy for people to criticize all the things which are wrong or lacking, or the dangers of a two-state solution, and then you ask, but what would you do instead?
Right.
And it's very hard to imagine Israel continuing to be a Jewish majority country and a democracy if it were to formally annex several million Palestinians living in the West Bank, let alone Gaza. So, and I don't think the Israeli government is particularly interested in doing that. They may talk about that to sometimes to appease the far right, but the actual reality of being like the government because really under the Oslo Accords, the population centers in the West Bank are supposed to be run the day-to-day affairs by the Palestinian Authority. I don't think the Israeli government wants to be responsible for trash collection and running the schools and police in those communities. So I don't think that's likely to happen. Now, with the Netanyahu government, no, I don't think a two-state solution's in the cards. But Israel has democracy, governments come and go. It's more important, I think, to prepare Israelis and Palestinians for that kind of compromise.
Right.
And Mika Goodman, who's an Israeli philosopher, he wrote a great book called Catch 67, and he said, it's really about understanding the debate within Israeli society. The Israeli left is correct that it isn't sustainable for Israel to be a Jewish majority country and a democracy if it were to continue to basically rule over millions of Palestinians. But the Israeli right, at least the security part of the right, is correct that Israel could be extremely vulnerable if it were to withdraw back to the 67 borders, where Israel is at some points 9, 10, 11 miles wide. Right, 9, 10, 11 miles to the ocean, right?
Very small geographic area to try to.
So I have sympathy for kind of both sides. Where I don't have sympathy are the people who don't come at it from really a security lens and more of more even ideology. It's almost like a religious, God wants us to do this. And
But would you agree, Ethan, that the settlements policy, the expansion of the settlements in the occupied territories, creates problems that preclude the possibility or make it more difficult to reach?
Not all settlements are created equal. So, for example, I'm going to be going back to Israel in November for the 10th time since 2016. So I've spent a considerable amount of time in parts which are considered to be the West Bank, parts which are considered to be the occupied territories, which you wouldn't even know because they are literally just bedroom communities of Jerusalem. And under under the peace offerings that Israel made that the Palestinians rejected in the early part of this century, it would not have been difficult to absorb the vast majority of Israelis living on the other side of the Green Line into Israel and swapping an equivalent amount of land, because the majority of them live on just a small percentage. Settlements which are much far afield, yes, that would be problematic, but Israel does have a track record of removing settlements. It did in the Sinai when it made the peace with Egypt. It did actually in Gaza. So,
and this maybe relates to the point you made earlier about governments come and go. This is a parliamentary democracy. Netanyahu's government won't always be there. There'll be somebody else.
I mean, if the government doesn't fall, and it may not, because it's complicated, they will have elections. Right? They do have elections. But I think the reality is that within Israeli society, they're still very much their view is colored by the Second Intifada and the terrorism of the early part of the century. And so it behoove the Palestinians to make clear to the Israelis that they are not interested in this as just step one, right? Accepting the legitimacy of Israel as a permanent reality. Trying to understand Jews as we understand ourselves and not pretending that we're just like the French in Algeria. That's not helpful.
Colonial power. Interestingly, I've read in the news of protests by Palestinians against the Palestinian Authority for a variety of issues, which leads me into sort of the next phase of this discussion. Protests in Israel. It's been widely reported. There was a story in the New York Times 2 weeks ago about some Israeli military reservists who are saying that they're going to refuse to serve if Prime Minister Netanyahu succeeds in curtailing the power of the courts in Israel to be a check on the government. Tell us what's going on, and I understand you were over there for some of these protests. What is going on in Israel?
So I should have prepared better because I've lost track if we're at week 36, 37, right, of the protests. But they've been going on for
a while.
For well over 30 consecutive weeks, over 35 consecutive weeks. It's amazing. I mean, it's like...
They've been some of the biggest protests in Israel's history.
I mean, if you would compare this to like Israel's population versus the American population, it would be like tens of millions of people showing up every week. Right, because Israel is only a country of about 9 million people. So if you have 200,000 people, 150,000 people every week showing up, like this is what you do on Saturday night, is you go to protest, either the main protest in Tel Aviv, or you go to the protest in Jerusalem, or smaller communities. The polling in Israel, which is pretty good, indicates that the moves that the governing coalition is making with respect to the independence of its judiciary, very unpopular. Right? So this is not a protest of the left against the right. This is a protest of the left, the center right, even some parts of the right against a government that really is misunderstanding its mandate. Because in the actuality, yes, it has 64 seats, but
in the Knesset
of 120, but the way it gained that was like a few thousand votes here or there. It could have looked very different.
This is basically what you often see in parliamentary systems, a coalition government, but it seems to be held together with the most fragile numbers.
Well, not that I have much sympathy for Prime Minister Netanyahu, but the reality is that if he keeps moving ahead, then his unpopularity and the popularity of his party will continue to grow, and the more damage which will happen to Israel. If he pulls back, he'll lose his governing coalition. They'll go to elections sooner than later, and they'll lose. Given if the polling today, of course, is accurate. And of course, the elections don't just happen the next day. But done a tremendous amount of damage. And what's interesting about these, these are the most patriotic protests. Like, they have completely embraced the Israeli flag. It's being organized and led by not just veterans, but like highly, like high-ranked veterans who've done commandos, pilots.
That's a good point. I don't see people out in the streets of Tel Aviv burning the Israeli flag.
These are extreme patriots. These are all extreme patriots who are fighting for for Zionism, for Israel as a democracy, as a Jewish country, and a country which balances not church and state, but synagogue and state, right? At least, and so yes, it's very inspiring. And you're right. I did attend 3 of the protests when I was there in April. Actually had an opportunity to, not to a huge crowd, but to speak at 2 of them, and they're inspiring, the Israelis who are participating in these protests,
and they're of all ages, and different
teenagers
groups.
To elderly folks. I mean, they're all just united behind. You can't fundamentally change how their democracy works on a slim parliamentary majority.
Right.
This is a country that doesn't have a constitution. It doesn't have a lot of the checks and balances that our country has that we take for granted, like federalism, bicameral legislature, meaningful difference between the executive and legislative branch. So the only check they have on majoritarianism, right? I wouldn't say democracy, majoritarianism, is their judiciary. And so that's what's at stake.
That's a very significant point. So let me ask you this, Ethan. Will Israel still be able to claim that it is this democracy that protects minority rights as well if the government strips the courts of power to check government actions? Will they still be able to claim that?
Well, the first thing that's going to, so the first bill has passed, right? And then there's many others that they're talking about doing. But it's before the Supreme Court in Israel. So the court literally has before it, right, this difficult decision about whether we agree to allow our own power to be constrained. Now, there is nothing in Israeli law that has like judicial review set up, but Marbury versus Madison was something our own Supreme Court created, right? And so what will the court do? I think that, the situation for minority rights, if this law is upheld, will be not as strong as it was beforehand. But this could be true for American states, where I think in Minnesota we have more rights than maybe people do, and no, not maybe, definitely do in other states, right?
Thinking recently of what was legislated with protection for the right to reproductive freedom.
It's completely depending on which side of the border you are between North Dakota and Minnesota.
So let's shift, if we could, again to another subject. Your interfaith partnerships. We touched on it briefly.
Yes.
Say a little bit more about that, how JCRC works with other faith leaders, faith coalitions to advance social justice and public policy goals.
Well, for social justice, I mean, JRLC is really kind of
what you talked
about earlier at the core of our work, because that's all about an anti-poverty agenda, but also many of our social service agencies that we support. So, for example, when I mentioned Jewish Family and Children's Service in Minneapolis, I mean, they're partnering with other social service agencies which may or may not be kind of based in a faith tradition, advocating for dollars from the state government match of private dollars to help improve people's lives. A lot of the work that we also do is around education. So interesting. I don't know if we talked about this the last time, but we were very involved in the rewriting, the decennial process of rewriting the state social studies standards and benchmarks. And here we have a little coalition of us, the Muslims, and the Sikh community to ensure that world religions were taught in public schools. And this actually, I think, does have a social justice hook, because if it's in the benchmarks, if it's legally required, it gives school districts a safe harbor to teach about religions such as Islam.
Which is very interesting, because we're living through a time right now where you look around at other U.S. states. I'm thinking particularly of Florida. I'm thinking of Texas and perhaps a few others, where efforts are actually being made to limit teaching about other cultures, other races, and their experience
or revisiting how we understood things like slavery.
Like slavery,
right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or like the settlement of the West, the American West, with the indigenous people who had been living there for thousands of years.
I mean, we have to be.
We have to be open
history isn't supposed to make you feel better, right? Now, I'm not saying that history is supposed to make you feel worse either. History is history, right? It needs to be approached honestly,
But we don't want to be ignoring whole sections of our history and saying we're not going to talk about that because somebody's feelings might get hurt.
Exactly. Yeah.
Very interesting. So
I'm in trouble with the connection. Please try again later.
We talked about the protests. One of the other things that JCRC is involved in is education about the Holocaust. And sadly, we live in a time, too, where there are people out there who propagate the big lie that the Holocaust never happened, which seems almost incomprehensible to me that any person could even say such a thing. So describe just briefly some of JCR's work in terms of Holocaust education.
Right. So at the core of our work is honoring and the victims and survivors of the Holocaust and teaching the next generation about the Holocaust or the Shoah, as it's sometimes referred to in Hebrew. Just this summer, my colleagues Laura Zell and Susie Greenberg led a trip to Europe for dozens of teachers from, I think, about 7 states to Poland, Germany, and Norway to visit sites related to the Holocaust. We are every year, actually, I think, given your past work with Sun Country, right? So we charter a flight with Sun Country every year, usually like late March, early April, to the Holocaust Museum, fill the entire plane with students and their teachers, college students, high school students, members of the National Guard, law enforcement, to go to a one-day trip to the Holocaust Museum. We teach teachers how to teach the Holocaust. We provide resources. Also, Speakers Bureau. For the longest time, it was survivors, and now it's really the descendants of the survivors, because we
sadly most of them have passed
and it was
away.
so special when at the session, Dora Zeidenweber, who is a 99-year-old survivor, was able to come to the Capitol and testify in favor of our bill. It was just remarkable. As I was saying to many of our friends in the press corps, I'm like, you don't have 99-year-olds testify on any bill, let alone about a bill about the Holocaust as a survivor.
Right.
So yeah, it's an absolute core of our work, but it's not just about the Holocaust and Shoah, because through this, for example, we have relationships with other communities which have been victims of genocide. Let's say the Ukrainian community with the Holodomor, right, or indigenous communities here in Minnesota, and so it's another opportunity for us to kind of do that outreach, bridging communities work around this shared history. And so they were very helpful partners, all of these other communities, in advancing this legislation.
I wish I could say I'd like to be hopeful that more people are waking up to the dangers posed by this kind of anti-Semitism and this kind of hatred. And usually it's not confined to one group, not just to Jewish people, but perhaps to immigrants, to people of color, to other various groups regarding their sexual preference or whatever it may be. So I sometimes say people are often equal opportunity haters when they engage in that kind of attitude or behavior. What is your personal opinion? Do you think that we're going to get to a point where the more this type of extremism is exposed, that we're going to be able to check it and hopefully lead to a society where we can live better with each other?
So I think, like often, two things can be true at the same time. It is, like, the facts are that anti-Semitic incidents have increased manyfold over the past several years. Really kind of beginning in 2016, year over year, we see these increases. And so the threat is greater, the need for resources and vigilance is greater. And at the same time, I don't think society as a whole has become more anti-Semitic, right? I don't think society as a whole necessarily has become more racist. I think that a few number of people can create a lot of harm. And so you have one, way of coping with the people who are trying to harm you, right? And that may be more for your security lens. And then there's everybody else, right? The people who are absolutely on your side, and then the vast majority of people in the middle who are good people, and education. Education is, and just understanding and getting to know people, right? Like, it's hard to hate people when you know them.
That's right. That's a very good point. Yeah.
So,
and often people in some communities, they don't know people of color in some rural communities. They don't know people of a different faith.
They don't know Jews. I mean, as I said to you, if 1% of Minnesota's population is Jewish,
out of a population of almost 6 million.
How many
people?
counties you think have we have 87 counties in Minnesota, right? And so part of our work actually. It's through, we're talking about education, getting into school districts, on the Zoom, right? Talking about Judaism, obviously not proselytizing,
Great work, Ethan, that JCRC is doing. Thank you for the work you and JCRC and your colleagues are doing. Your colleague Steve Hunnigs has been a guest on this show many times. Ethan Roberts, Deputy Executive Director, JCRC of Minnesota and the Dakotas, thank you for being our guest today on Access to Democracy.
Thank you.